What's up, everybody? It's Izzy, and in today's video, what I'm going to talk about is the difference between process-oriented thinking and goal-oriented thinking. I do want to start off with the caveat that this is just my opinion. There's schools of thought, in say Western schools of thought, that are much more goal-oriented than I would recommend, and I'm not going to pretend like I know enough to say that that's for sure wrong. And then there's, Eastern schools of thought, we'll call it, that would say that I'm not going far enough in the direction of process-oriented thinking with the way that I handle things. So first of all, let's quickly define what process-oriented thinking and goal-oriented thinking are. Goal-oriented thinking is the classical sense of you set a goal and you write it down and you have a deadline and all the things that you're taught about goal setting when you're young. So for example, I want to bench 315 in 6 months would be an example of somebody who is goal-oriented, and that's their focus, is whether or not they can get that 315 in 6 months. Now, somebody who is process-oriented with their approach to things is going to be more along the lines of, instead of I want to bench 315 by March, they're going to say, in the time until March, I want to have 95% of my nights have 8 to 9 hours of sleep, or maybe 100%. It depends on what the person's goal is. I want to be within 5% of my assigned macros 95% of the days. I don't want to miss a single training session. Things like that. These are things that you have full control over. At the end of the day, you don't have full control over the rate at which you make progress. So the argument on the side of the process-oriented thinking camp is that, ironically, by maximizing the inputs, you maximize the output. And an example that I give to people that kind of makes this clear is let's take two hypothetical people, right? And one of them sets a goal to bench 315 by March. Let's say 6 months go by and they only bench 310. Now, let's say that let's say for this hypothetical example that their sleep was perfect, that their nutrition was perfect, that their programming was perfect, and they actually did make substantial progress. Now, is this truly a failure because they didn't reach their goal by the deadline? It's hard to look at it that way for me personally, because in this hypothetical example, we're assuming that they did everything perfectly. And if they did everything perfectly, they could not have made progress any faster. That's, the hypothetical example that we're setting up here. Now, imagine someone that also set a goal to bench 315 by March, and they do hit 315 by March. However, they averaged, let's say, 5 hours of sleep a night. Their macros were rarely tracked anything. Their programming was not optimized for them as an individual. All of these things, right? So let's just say that there's some suboptimal conditions, but just through the sheer fact that they have good genetics, or maybe they're a new lifter, they still made great progress anyway. In one sense, this is obviously a success because you're making progress, you're moving forward. But in another sense, if you're talking about things from the prism of an elite athlete focused on, getting to the highest level possible, this is not a successful training period because they could have done much, much better if they optimized the process. So the interesting aspect of this topic comes into play when you think about striking a balance between these two mindsets. Because the reality of the situation is that you can't solely be focused on the process, because then you have no way to measure whether or not it's working. And understanding and having realistic expectations for progress and having goals is the single biggest and most important part of evaluating your process and whether or not your process is working and whether or not that process needs further improvement and changes in order to get your progress to a realistic level. So again, how do you strike the balance here? Because powerlifting is a sport that's all about the numbers. It's all about whether or not you're improving. So how do you know whether you need to make changes to your programming or whatever because you're not making progress fast enough or you're not making any progress? So there is an element, in my opinion, where you need to measure things and see if it's improving or not and see if the rate of improvement is acceptable. So, in my opinion, the way that you can strike a balance between these two camps, between these two ways of thinking, these two ideologies, is to have the goal setting aspect as simply a part of the process. So I know that's confusing, but people maximizing your psychology, your individual psychology, is an element of the process, no matter what the sport is. That's why there are sports psychologists. I mean, there is a mental side to pretty much every sport. So doing what you can to maximize that mental side is almost always going to include some type of goal setting and having a realistic framework for what is possible. And generally, you need to develop a realistic framework for what is possible through training for a few years just to see how you personally respond to it. So let me get back to the actual point of the video here, and that is, how do you strike a balance between these two paradoxical ways of thinking, these two different ideologies? And the answer to me is simply that they're both true, and that you have to incorporate aspects of both styles of thinking, because ultimately the only way that you can judge the quality of your process and know whether or not it needs improvement is by the results that it produces or fails to produce. So part of the process is going to include evaluation at various points. Generally, the most appropriate place for this, of course, is at the end of a training cycle, trying to constantly ask yourself and evaluate things throughout the entire training cycle is usually less than productive because it allows doubt to creep in. But ultimately, you have to figure out what works best for you psychologically and incorporate that into your process, because psychology is a key aspect of sport. At the end of the day, figuring out how to keep yourself intense, focused, and motivated is going to be a slightly different puzzle for different people. Some people are going to do just fine without having a specific number to chase, and other people aren't. But even if you are one of those people that does better with a specific goal, a specific number to chase, it's important to also simultaneously realize that the most important thing is the process, and that if you're doing everything that you can, you're doing everything that you can. And at the same time, for those who are more process-oriented by nature, it's important to realize that ultimately, at the end of the day, what matters the most is whether or not your process is producing the results that it should. So you have to figure out a way to hold both these paradoxical realities inside of your head simultaneously. And like I said, my solution to that is somewhat straightforward, and that's just to make sure that part of your process is figuring out what makes you tick psychologically and what keeps you at the highest levels of motivation. Anyways, that's all I have to say on that subject. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. As always, my friends, have a nice day and good luck with your training. Peace.